All right. So let's start. Welcome to this seminar. It's the third in a series of seminars on IDS and NXT Ocean. And I would like to start with a short introduction. So with me today here is Miriam Brenner. She's managing the B39 Academy that also organizes this seminar series here. And I am Alexander Windberg. I work at IDS in research and development. And yeah, I'm looking at deep learning algorithms and how we can implement them for our hardware and how we can make them applicable for users. All right, if you have questions during this session, I'd like to ask you to put them into the chat. Miriam will collect the questions and well, let's see, probably we'll answer them during the session, or there definitely will be a question and answer session in the end. If we shouldn't have time to answer all the questions, we can also get back to you via email. Okay, so as I said, this series is about our latest product line, IDS NXT Ocean. And if you attended one of the last seminars, you've probably already seen this picture by Patrick Schick, my colleague, and he probably introduced to you already this product. The goal of it is to allow users to train and solve their deep learning problems with this package here. So that package contains everything that's necessary to train and run a neural network, from the IDS NXT Rio camera that can be used to acquire training images. The training images can then be uploaded to our training platform, IDS NXT Lighthouse, where you can just with a few clicks train your model. And you can download these trained models and run them again on the same camera. We have a dedicated accelerator for deep learning algorithms on the camera. And so then everything can be run on the camera. Good. Today I'd like to focus not so much on what we can deliver with this package, but I'd like to focus more on a few things you could take care of to make your approach to deep learning probably a bit more efficient. So accordingly, the topic of this session will be deep learning basics and approaches, and accordingly the outline will be basics and approaches, but I can also be a bit more specific here. I will be introducing you to a few to the deep learning terminology, a bit of background concepts which I always found useful. And for those who didn't attend the last seminars, I'd also like to show you a short recap of how we use the IDS NXT Ocean tools. Then we'll switch to a bit more practical part where it's really about how to approach a deep learning problem. And the first question will be, what's the right problem? How does a good data set look like? What options do you have, and what happens behind the scenes in Lighthouse during the training? And what options do you have when choosing a model for the camera? All right. So first of all, I'd like to start with the terminology. Artificial intelligence is, probably a quite philosophical term also when it comes to the technical part, a bit fuzzy and maybe loaded with emotions, high expectations, probably fears. So what I like to talk today is just a set of algorithms, a set of tools to solve specific problems. And while these algorithms are great in extracting complex correlations from data, they have at least yet no means to derive causation or to get the bigger picture. So instead of the term AI, I'd like to switch to something more technical, which is this case, machine learning. And my favorite definition on the difference of the two is that if it's written in Python, it's machine learning. If it's in PowerPoint, it's AI. So that one's in PowerPoint. So there's that. Okay. Well, machine learning basically means that your algorithm is capable of learning from example data and improve by seeing example data and apply the learned knowledge on new and unseen data. The subclass of machine learning that utilizes neural networks is deep learning, that gained a lot of popularity during the past few years. And another subclass within this deep learning field is convolutional neural networks. And these are the algorithms I am talking about today and that you can train on Lighthouse and that you can run on the camera. And these algorithms are particularly successful in image processing. Okay, so in order to illustrate the difference between deep learning approaches and classical rule-based approaches, I'd like to provide the following simple example. Just imagine you'd have to describe me how a drawing of a camera would look like. Maybe you'd come up with something like this. So the simplest way of drawing a camera is just having a rectangle with a circle inside, and already you have a very simple set of rules to describe a camera. However, there are cases when reality is a bit more complex. So maybe I'll be confronted with such an object, and of course we can update our set of rules to also cover this one. However, when it comes to these drawings, basically every person has a different way of drawing a camera. So there is a lot of variety, and it's really difficult to cover this full variety with a set of rules in advance. So in this case, it would be much simpler if you could just show me a few of these images, tell me, okay, this is how a camera looks like, and from that on, I'll learn that. I'll implicitly learn the rules that make a camera, and I'll be able to infer this transfer this knowledge on new and unseen drawings. And this is a problem that's also quite suitable for neural networks, and this is also quite similar to how a neural network would learn these rules. So how does that work? Neural networks are great in extracting information from images. They extract this information and formulate them in a set of abstract features. These can be tens or hundreds or thousands of features to describe complex image contents, and they are not always easy to interpret. But just for the sake of clarity, let's imagine we pick out two of these features and we can plot them. So we have here the rectangliness on the y-axis and the circularity on the x-axis, and each image that we put in the neural network can be represented by such a dot in the feature space. So all these camera images will probably occupy one space here. And if we train the neural network to distinguish drawings of cameras between drawings of people, then the neural network, the feature extraction, will learn meaningful features and will learn to separate these two classes as much as possible in this feature space, and it will learn a rule to separate the two. So basically included here, we have a huge set of rules that have not been set explicitly, but have been learned implicitly by looking at the example images. So while this part here is probably rather easy to solve and can also be solved with other machine learning approaches, the real asset of the neural network lies here in the feature extraction. This is the really complex part with a lot of complexity inside. And I hope I can illustrate a bit what happens when an image passes this feature extraction here. So let's just imagine we put this image of a cheetah inside the feature extraction, which consists of several layers, stacked layers of image filters. Now each filter is specialized during the training to extract a certain feature from this image, and each filter produces such a so-called feature map, like you can see it here. So each of these feature maps shows the spots in the image where a feature was found, like in yellow. Probably this example here of a filter concentrated on the black spots of the fur of the cheetah. So each output of each layer is then forwarded to the next layer, and so on. So each time the input information is combined and new features are produced and the image is scaled down, and so on and so on and so on. So with each layer, we produce more and more features and sacrifice more and more spatial resolution. In the end, there's the cheetah is barely visible or noticeable here, but we have probably hundreds or thousands of features extracted. Now, what we can say is that the feature extraction transforms spatial information, like it's here in the image, to abstract feature information. We go, as the image passes the feature extraction, go from a small perceptive field to a large perceptive field. You can probably imagine that each pixel here in the final feature maps contains a lot of information of the input image, of the input pixels. And accordingly, we go from very generic features here in the first layers, like simple color gradients or contrasts, edges, something like this, to very specific features where the filters can already extract parts of the cheetah, like the leg or the head or something like this. Now, this information is compressed even more. We can only take the strongest or the most relevant pixel from each of these feature maps and just put them in such a vector where the green dots mean the feature has not been found in the input image, and the yellow ones means, we found a certain feature here. So that was the feature extraction. The feature extraction is great for structured data. Images are structured. Their neighboring pixels have a stronger relation to each other than far apart pixels. And we transformed this into just such a vector of abstract features, which is unstructured. It doesn't matter which feature sits next to which other feature. So in order to interpret this image, we have to map it to our desired output. Let's imagine we'd like to classify several classes of wild cats. And one of these possible outputs would be jaguar. So for the jaguar, it would be important to have these upper two features here represented in the image, which is not the case in this example. What's the case in this example, that we have these two features here in the image that are important for identifying a cheetah, which is in this case, of course, also correct. Right, so now from the input image, we produced, or the neural network produced through the feature extraction, a set of features describing the image, and this has been mapped to get the desired output. This output could look like this. So neural network will put out something like, we are seeing a camera here with a confidence of 0.9 of 90%. That's good, but not perfect. And the nice thing about these neural networks is they can learn by showing them more examples. So if our camera drawing expert looks at this image, then they're quite certain that this is with high confidence a camera. And the neural network learns by comparing this label with the prediction, with its own prediction. A sort of error is calculated. The difference between the two is calculated, and this is called the loss function. And this error can be back-propagated into the algorithm, and all the parameters in the feature extraction, the feature mapping, are adapted automatically to reduce this error. Of course, this doesn't work in just one iteration, but probably takes a few tens of thousands of iterations like this. So I hope I could illustrate a bit how a neural network roughly works. That would be the basics part. And with that, I'd like to switch to the bit more practical part. And I'd like to talk about how to approach deep learning problems. Now, the first step of approaching the problem is probably having the right problem. This is a very important part. So I'd like to spend a few slides on how a good deep learning problem looks like. Of course, that's hard to say to cover in advance completely, but a good rule of thumb is if you have an expert and the expert can make an educated and intuitive decision just by looking at an object, a qualitative decision, that's probably also a good problem for deep learning. One example I took out from agriculture is this one. So agriculture is, I think, a great field because it combines many challenges neural networks can solve. So one of these examples is this vineyard has mites and could look like this. So why are neural networks really good for this? Because they can, through this really rich and complex feature extraction, they can deal with a very high background variety. So in these outdoor scenarios, you might have rainy weather, sunny weather, anything in between. You have a very high object variety. So each wine leaf is basically individual. It's hard to put these all in rules. And then we can have very high feature similarity. So here you have these sign of mite infestation, and here you have just a simple water of droplets. And that would be really hard or impossible to put all in a set of rules, but deep learning can learn this implicitly and solve this problem. So this is not restricted, of course, to agriculture. Basically, every time an expert can make a decision, an intuitive quantitative decision, like this part is broken, something's broken here, or here's something missing that should be there. It's likely that you could solve that with a deep learning algorithm. On the other hand, quantitative measurements like these, so if your expert needs to get a caliper first to answer or to make a decision, then probably it's better to approach this with a rule-based algorithm. Good. Now we have a good problem, and we'd, of course, like to enable you to solve your problem with our camera, with a neural network for our camera. However, we figured out that there are quite a few thresholds to take until you arrive at this point. You'll have to acquire a data set, which of course simplifies a lot if you have the right problem to begin with. You have to acquire some knowledge. You have to put this knowledge into code. You have to write a deep learning or define a deep learning architecture. You have to script your training. You have to acquire hardware, install it, maintain it in order to run your training, and then you'll end up with a model and you can run it on the camera. So what we'd like to achieve with IDS NXT-Ocean is to put these things into our Lighthouse training platform and flatten out this threshold as much as possible to get you to this point as fast and easily as possible. The reason is that I'd say only here you'll realize certain aspects that need to be improved. So I think deep learning approaches are quite iterative and empiric. So you really have to set up a real world test scenario to validate your trained neural network. And likely you'll realize, okay, maybe I need a bit more data. Maybe I need a bit of different data, or you might realize I finally need a different approach. So our goal is to make this improvement cycle as smooth and quick as possible. All right. For the rest of this session, I'd like to go through these points here individually and give you a bit of background information on these. And I'd like to start with the data set. And for that, I'd like to switch to our IDS NXT Rio camera. I've set up a small demo here. And I've set up one of our Rio cameras, and the goal is here to check the presence or the absence of these foam kisses. And I'm not sure if this is an international thing or if this is just German. So this is some sort of sweets, and to be honest, I really start to dislike them because I had so many of these. But nevertheless, I think it makes a nice demonstration. So this is the cockpit, and yeah, you can set all imaging parameters here. Every option you have here is also available through the REST interface of the camera, which has been shown to you by Patrick Schick during the last seminar. And so what's new about this camera is it can run onboard vision apps. We have several of these, and we'll activate the crawler to acquire small training samples of images of these foam kisses. Now, we can set an area of interest to acquire this image, and we start in the background. Well, I have already started it. A local file server that runs on my local machine to manage incoming data. So I can connect several camera devices to this web server, to this file server, and this file server will manage all incoming data locally. Good. So now let's take a few training images of the present foam kisses of an absent foam kiss, like that. You can see here that the images have been successfully transmitted. And now let's just imagine that your quality assurance takes taste samples of these foam kisses, and you probably don't want to have these sent out to the customers. Yeah, you start with a presence absence measurement, which is a quite simple task, and then you learn something new about your application, and you can simply add this data set later. You can type in directly a class name to put these images directly into the right folder. So let's save a few images to the error folder. All right. So the data has been stored now at the specified location, and we didn't type any class name here. This is the presence absence data. Each image comes with a small JSON file containing some meta information about the images. And we have the error class here. So with it basic data set, we can go to our Lighthouse platform and train our first neural network. I have to say that, of course, I did some preparation beforehand. So I took a few example images before that. So that's not the only data, as you'll see now. I've logged on our Lighthouse platform. We can start new projects here, but I'd like to first take care of the data set. As you can see here, I already created two data sets for the presence absence and for the errors. Now, let's start with our first iteration with a presence absence measurement. If you click on the data set, you see this overview here. You have a statistics here that tells you that we have roughly 150 images per class. I've already labeled all these images. Now, if I'd like to add some new data, the ones we've just taken here. So let's not take the misplaced error images. We can open these and we can just upload them. And as you might notice, now we have a few unlabeled images added to our data set. So I can filter for these unlabeled images, and I can get to a full screen view of the images just by clicking on them. And in this view, I can simply add labels and navigate through the data set until I'm finished. But yeah, I think you get the concept, so I'm not labeling all the images right now. Instead, I'd like to go back to the foam kisses with errors. So since we already put them in the right folder, I can just upload all images in this folder and directly add the error label to all images I'm going to upload, so I don't have to label them later. All right, so we have a few more examples now, and all the images are already labeled. Good. We have two small example data sets. You can see, or you will see that with these few hundreds of images, we can already get some nice first results. And yeah, with that, I'd like to get back to the presentation and give you some background information on what to take care of when assembling a data set and when taking images. So first thing, of course, image quality is still relevant. It's a very simple rule of thumb, of course, but if you can't see the image, the feature you're looking for in the image, then the algorithm can't either. So it's a very simple statement, of course, but please keep in mind that the neural network scales down images in order to process them, most likely to something like 224 times 224 pixels. And if you choose an image crop that's too large, then, and if you would like to detect this crack here in the image, then probably there is no way for the neural network to learn anything from this image. So here we have the crack we'd like to detect. Just realized that I didn't switch on my laser pointer. And here you don't see it anymore because the downscaling was too strong. Good. So rule number one, it's obvious, but the features have to be visible for the algorithm. So now we zoomed in a little bit, and as you can see, the feature is visible in the image, but still this is not optimal because you'd like to label this here as a defect part, but you have also examples of several good parts here in the image. So it will be much harder for the neural network. It will take much more data to learn the difference because you have good examples here as well, and only one of them is wrong. So it's much better to set the right area of interest to get only one object and label this one object as faulty. Of course, you'll also have a better resolution on the actual feature you'd like to detect. So summarizing, it's always better to get a higher object to background ratio. So the higher the object to background ratio, the less data you'll need to train the network, and the higher the accuracy will be. Okay, so you've set up your imaging. Now the question is how to assemble these images into a good data set. And for that, I'd like to go back to the image I've shown in the beginning where we represent each image with such a point in our made up feature space, rectangleness and circularity. Now we have several of these images we trained the neural network with, and the neural network puts them somewhere here in the feature space, and we can characterize them by such a distribution. So we can say our training data lies within this distribution. The goal now is to cover the full variety of real-world application data with our training data. So if the distribution of application data lies completely within the training data, then this is the optimal case scenario. However, it's not always easy to get this right in the beginning. One example how this could go wrong you can see here. Let's just imagine I acquired the training data by taking drawings from a tablet, for example. But in my real-world application, I'd like to have the camera classify these pictures. So they are drawn on paper. They experience shot noise, of course. They have varying lighting conditions. So there's a lot more variety in the application data than in the training data. And that probably looks something like this. But that's not the worst thing, because once you trained your first model, you put it in the application, you learn how your application data will look like, and you can iteratively expand the training data set to cover the application variety. So first goal is to have a representative data set. The best thing is, of course, to take the training data from the same setup you'll later on use the neural network on. Second thing to take care of is have a balanced data set. This is another example of how not to do it. We have a lot more training examples from our camera class and a lot less in our person class. If we're going back to the feature space, this would look somewhat like this. So the green dots represent the cameras, the yellowish dots represent the people, and an ideal neural network would learn a rule probably similar, somewhat like this. This would mean we have an accuracy of 100% in the end. Now, the problem is if the neural network completely fails, it will still look like an accuracy of 85%, which might still sound like the neural network learned something. So neural networks tend to ignore underrepresented classes, and you probably won't realize if you're only looking at the accuracy. So, of course, if you check in the real world scenario, you'll immediately notice that the output doesn't make any sense. Good. So, second thing to take care of is having a roughly balanced data set. It doesn't have to be exactly balanced. We have a few means mathematically to take care of a bit of unbalancedness, but in the end, it's always better to have a balanced data set. So the third point is a data set bias, which probably happens most frequently. And that would look like somehow like this. If your training data completely or partially misses the application distribution. So that's a bad case. How could you imagine this would look like? Just imagine all of our camera pictures have been drawn with a green marker and all the person images have been drawn with a red marker, and you'll show in the application an image like this. So it's very ill-defined. You can't really tell if the color features will be dominant or the shape features will be dominant. So you certainly try and like to avoid this. And again, taking the training data from the application might help here. Good. So this was the part about the data set. Representative, balanced, unbiased data is good. And we can switch back to Lighthouse and now actually start the training. So this is the data set. And now we switch to the projects. I can start a new project, enter a title here, but as I said, I've already prepared a little something. Let's go to the foam check. We can add a short description here. We can add an email address if you'd like to be notified once the training's finished. Here we can choose which data we would like to use for the training. We can choose any of the data sets we just provided. This one will just, in the first step, look for the presence or the absence of these foam kisses, and that we can already go to the training. You have a few options here. You can set some random image transformation to artificially augment the dataset. I'll get back to that later. And we have a variety of neural network sizes that will take different time on the camera. If you're not sure what to choose, let's train several ones, so just the smallest and the biggest maybe. And now these trainings are queued here and are waiting to be started. And yeah, we'll have to check the timing of this presentation. I hope these trainings will be finished by the time I get back here. And we can use the trainings I've prepared here. If that's not the case, I already trained a few neural networks in the past and networks are still accessible. I can always download them. You can deploy these models as often as you like. Let's get back to the error classes. So now basically that's just the same thing as the presence absence, but I additionally add the error class. Just start the training as before. Okay, so I have a small overview here that shows me that two of these projects have work in progress. So let's leave them to their business and check back later. So now what happens once we pressed that train button? Well, what happens to your data set is the data set is split into a training data set that makes up in a ratio of 80% to 20%, and the 20% are put into a validation data set. And only the training data set is used for actually adapting the model parameters. Both of the data sets are undergoing a pre-processing. As I mentioned before, the image resolution is scaled to fit the neural network input. And there is a normalization that transfers the number range to a range, for example, of -1 to 1 to standardize all the input data. Then only the training data set goes through this augmentation process where the simple transformations, geometric transformations are performed like slide rotations, zooms, mirroring, and so on. And then in the end, you'll have your train data set and you have your validation data set, which is not altered because this should be a measure to see how well your model generalizes on unseen and as realistic as possible data. So why do we perform this split? Again, back to the feature space. Another simple example, we'd like to have a two-way classifier. We'd like to separate the green dots from the blue dots. And the underlying distribution just shows a simple linear rule. So if our model learns the optimal rule, we'll have an optimal accuracy of 72%, which is just a made-up example. So such a simple problem can, of course, be solved much more accurately. The problem now is that our neural network has a lot of information capacity, a lot of free parameters to come up with a, let's say, more creative rule here. So what can happen is the model learns by heart individual data points. This is called overfitting. So you'll have a perfect training accuracy, but the model didn't learn any meaningful rule. And we check this by applying the validation data set in the end. So these data points have not been used by the model to adapt the parameters, and so it couldn't learn them by heart. If we had now the correct linear rule here, we end up with a validation accuracy of 100%, which is good. But in this case, where the rule doesn't make any sense and doesn't generalize to unseen data, we end up with a random accuracy. Basically, the model didn't learn anything meaningful here. So this is why when we talk about the accuracy, this is the certainly the more relevant measure, the validation accuracy. Okay, so what happens next? We provided the data input pipeline. Now we can actually feed training images into the training for the neural network, and we don't feed all the images, all the data set at once, but we provide small batches of, for example, 32 images at once. These are put into the training. The neural network will calculate the error based on these 32 examples and will optimize its parameters to reduce the error. And this happens again with a second batch, and this goes on until each image has been processed in this training. And by that we call the end of the first epoch. One epoch means each training image has been run through the neural network once. At the end of each epoch, the validation data set is also run through the neural network, but not to adapt the parameters, but only to extract the accuracy. So this is how such a training sequence would look like. We start usually with a quite poor accuracy of the neural network, but it increases as the training progresses, and ideally we'll end up with a nice saturation, a nice convergence at a high accuracy. So what you can see here down here is that the model performs a training for 60 epochs. That means basically that each training image is seen by the neural network 60 times. And this is why it's so important, or why it can be very important to have this artificial augmentation of your data set that randomly, for each epoch, randomly transforms images. So the neural network doesn't see the exact same image twice during the training. Okay. How does this now look like in Lighthouse? As we can see, the training is going nicely. We have here the larger model that also takes more time. We can see that it has only trained for 2 epochs, so that would take some more time. And down here we have the smaller model. Yeah, that comes along a lot faster. I've already 33 epochs trained, so that's the smallest one. And yeah, I hope it will be done very soon. So the next thing to notice probably is that here in the training progress bar, it tells you that the training is step 1 of 3 and here 2 of 3. So next I would like to explain a bit what these steps mean. So usually we don't train the full model at once. We use certain technique that's very that's basically a standard technique that helps you to save a lot of data and a lot of time. And what we do is we don't train the full neural network at once, but we have pre-trained the models on a large variety of real-world objects. So the model could learn a very broad and generic feature extraction, and the learned features are relevant for a large variety of images. So what we can do now is, if we have such a problem like identifying cameras, we don't have to adapt the feature extraction, but what we only have to adapt the mapping of the feature to get the desired output. We only have to train these few parameters instead of these many. This is called transfer learning, and this is step 1 in Lighthouse language. Now, sometimes it helps to also adjust the upper layers of the feature extraction in the next steps just slightly, because probably you can imagine that the upper layers here contain very specific features which are very tailored to certain objects. So it might help to adapt these features to your specific problem and also this one. And so this is training step 2 and 3. By the way, when I'm showing this image, this is of course just a very rough sketch of how a network architecture could look like. This is not actually what our architecture looks like, but I think it gets a bit more clearer this way. So what we don't have to touch in most cases is these layers down here that contain the very generic features like color gradients and contrast and edges, which are relevant to some degree in most of the cases. So these are the different training steps. Now I'd like to talk about the model size or time option. So as you've seen, we offer a certain variety of model sizes, and of course, bigger models can potentially reach higher accuracies, but also take longer on the camera to be processed or to process a single image. So in many cases, if you switch to a larger model, you'll get a higher accuracy. But also in most cases, well, definitely in all cases, because we can't measure any accuracy larger than 1, we'll see this saturation effect. So at some point, it doesn't really pay off anymore to switch to a larger model. And this is, of course, no exact rule, but this is how such a scaling curve would look like. So each model here on the line is a bit bigger, reaches probably a slightly higher accuracy, and takes more time to process on the camera. This saturation always occurs. Now, for simpler cases, like in our case, this saturation occurs earlier. If you just have to classify 2 classes, that's why it's there, in this case, mostly fine to use a smaller model like we just did. This very smallest model will already perform just as well as the larger one. So you don't have to use as much training data. It doesn't take that long on the camera. Of course, while we add more and more error classes, for example, this curve might flatten out and the saturation will occur later. And here it makes, of course, much more sense to switch to a larger model. Now, in a scenario where you don't have any time constraints or requirements, well, it can't hurt to take the largest model. But I guess in most cases you have some sort of time constraint, and then you can just pick the model on the slider which meets this specification. If you're not sure, again, we try to promote an empiric approach to this subject, so just train a few networks and see how they perform in reality. Okay, and with so much for the background information on what the training does on Lighthouse. I'd like to go back to our training, and yeah, it's done. You can see here that the larger models is still training, but the smaller one, which I just trained, is already finished. We can download the model here. It's already translated and optimized for the camera. So this was the project with the errors. Let's take the other one too. Yeah, same here. So this one's already done. Download it. And now we can go back to the camera, to the cockpit, and activate the According Vision app, the CNN Manager that is capable of loading several neural networks. So we can upload the models we just trained. So that's the ones from today. So we can store several neural networks in the camera memory, and we can just switch between them on the fly. The hardware is not, the architectures are not burned into the hardware. It's just a configuration file for the accelerator on the FPGA that can be loaded, and from then on the FPGA will run the neural network and solve your specific problem. So this is the first network, the presence-absence measurement. You can see that there is no foam kiss evident down here. And when I switch over here, it's clearly present. When I go up here, it's absent again. Good. So now, of course, this problem can also be easily solved with a simple histogram approach, maybe. But I hope that I could show you that it's really easy and simple. It doesn't require any programming effort to get to this kind of application with neural networks. Also, when you want to detect errors, then you might probably, and as the errors get more and more complex, maybe it will also require more and more rules to get to such an approach. So I think here deep learning is a really nice and iterative way to increase the complexity and the scope of the application. So I just switched to the other model that has 3 classes. We can see here that we clearly have an error. It still classifies the absent and the present foam kiss correctly. And just to get the arc to the beginning, I would like to prove to you that that the neural network indeed can identify images, drawings. We just have to switch to the according model, like here. And now the neural network identifies this person correctly. And as soon as I apply a set of whiskers, ugly whiskers, it still identifies as a cat. And okay, let's finally also do the camera. Yep, it's camera. Very good. So that was basically the complete circle from data acquisition through the Lighthouse training back to the inference, to the deployment on the camera. And I hope you found the background information useful. I provided a small summary here. So deep learning, I think, is best suited for qualitative and intuitive decisions. It's always helpful to simplify the problem first down to a minimum. So don't classify all error classes at once, but probably start with okay, not okay. So that helps you reduce the required data, lowers the error susceptibility, and gets you to your first real-world test setup as quickly as possible. And at that point, you learn a lot more and you can increase the complexity gradually. Okay, I already said it, but I'll say it again. Real-world performance checks are really important. Right. So I also hope that I could interest you in IDS NXT Ocean and that I could convince you that this empiric experimental approach is a good way to get started if you want to approach a neural network, a deep learning problem. Thank you very much for your interest in this seminar. And it's been a pleasure. And I wish you a good remainder of the day.